Erin heard the front door open but feigned sleep. Usually she would meet her husband when he returned from his night shift, and he appreciated it despite pretending to be annoyed. "You could have slept in," Glenn would say, feigning irritation. "It's so early. Can't I make tea or heat up my meal by myself?" Erin would just shrug, taking pleasure in welcoming her husband home. Rising an hour earlier was a small sacrifice for the man she loved. But this time she had a different plan. When she heard Glenn peek into the bedroom, she continued to feign deep sleep. "Erin?" her husband called softly. She didn't respond and he left the room, attempting to close the bedroom door quietly behind him. However, it wouldn't fully close with a light touch. Erin sighed. If she got up to close it now, Glenn would know she was awake, ruining the surprise. She decided to be patient for a bit longer. Suddenly, Erin heard Glenn on the phone. She wondered who could be calling this early. "I can't come now, sweetheart. Don't you understand? I just got home." Erin was stunned. Lying on her belly, she could feel her heart pounding, the rhythm echoing through the pillow. She couldn't hear what the person on the other end was saying, but the voice was thin and childish. "No, now I can't. I'm sorry," Glenn continued. "Let's arrange for later this afternoon or evening." He sighed. "Don't be upset, please. You know how much I love you. I'll try to come tonight, my sunshine." Apparently, the pleas had not worked, and the thin voice on the phone grumbled resentfully before hanging up. Glenn went to take a shower, and once Erin heard the sound of running water, she allowed herself to cry. "That's what I got after many years of marriage and 2 kids, she thought. "I believed I'd found the happiness with a loving partner by my side, except this partner gets a call from his mistress at 6 a.m, and he's explaining why he can't come over." Erin was born in a small village far away from the big metropolis. Her parents, Alberta and Graham, were overjoyed with her. She was cheerful, energetic, intelligent, and radiated positivity like a ray of sunshine. The little girl was always ready to help her mother around the house. Even from a young age, she was curious about everything, especially in the kitchen. Alberta was always worried that Erin might burn herself or accidentally break something, but it seemed as if the girl had an instinct for it, or as if someone invisible was looking out for her. By the time she reached 3rd grade, Erin could cook lunch or dinner for the entire family. Even though Alberta was a good cook herself, she admitted that Erin's dishes tasted better. Graham noticed this too. "It seems our daughter could become a great cook," Graham often said. "She might even open her own restaurant one day." But Erin hadn't thought about owning a restaurant yet. She was just interested in cooking to please her parents and grandparents. Although she had many friends in the village, she wished she had siblings. However, she was generally a happy child and grew up in a loving, strong family. Then, disaster struck. Her father went with the men to cut down forest, and a tree fell on him. He was immediately rushed to the town by the men. The doctors did their best, but Graham was left paralysed from the waist down. Erin had just turned 12 years old. From that moment on, the entire burden of the household fell on Erin and her mother. They had a large household to manage: a horse, 2 cows, chickens, ducks, a dog, cats, and a vegetable garden, which was essential for survival in the village. Erin and her mother shouldered this responsibility. Milking cows, herding a horse, feeding numerous ducks and chickens, caring for her ailing father, plus her schoolwork, was undoubtedly tough for Erin. But she never complained, as she saw that her parents were even more burdened. Her mother was the sole teacher at the village primary school. Despite the small number of children, it was a significant workload for Alberta. The woman often returned home late, while Erin arrived from high school in the neighbouring town an hour before her. In that time, Erin would manage to prepare dinner, look after the livestock, and assist her father. She saw how her father, confined to a wheelchair, suffered with his helplessness. It was then that Erin decided that when she grew up, She would help her parents so that they wouldn't have to work so hard. And when the time came, she pursued her passion for cooking by enrolling in culinary school. "How will you manage without me?" Erin asked her parents before leaving for the city. "Do not worry, daughter," Alberta reassured her. "We'll sell a horse and cows, and things will become easier. Plus, our relatives won't leave us without help. We'll manage." Erin looked at her father, who was smiling. "Go, my daughter," he said. "We believe in you. You'll open your own restaurant." Erin enjoyed studying. Student life was the most carefree and fun time of her life. Despite the lack of money and living in a 3-person dorm room, the youthfulness and the people around her easily compensated for all this. Erin and her roommates managed to do everything. They attended classes, did homework, and even went out after classes. By her second year, Erin took a part-time job as an assistant cook in a small but cosy restaurant. The chief, Mrs. Sullivan, was a kind woman around 65 years old, and she also was the owner of that restaurant. Mrs. Sullivan was immediately drawn to the young, quick, responsible, and talented girl. "You must understand," she said to Erin once, "if you continue to work here, in time you could become the head chef here." Erin smiled at such a suggestion and asked, "What about you?" Mrs. Sullivan waved her hand dismissively. "I'm not going to stand at the cooker until I'm 80. I've spent so many years in the kitchen. I will retire to Italy, savouring wine, eating pasta and admiring handsome men." Erin laughed. "Okay, I'll think about it." She enjoyed working here, especially under the guidance of Mrs. Sullivan. The culinary school taught her the correct procedures and proven technology, strictly according to the recipe. But as the experienced chef Mrs. Sullivan had her own secrets. "It's not only my way," she told Erin. "Every good chef accumulates a wealth of tricks throughout their career, and they don't share them with anyone. And don't you share yours with anyone either." The girl laughed. "But you've shared yours with me, haven't you?" Mrs. Sullivan shrugged. "You're my student, that's different. I'm going to delegate my business to you because I believe in you." When Erin already had 1 week left before her graduation party, an accident happened. She had just finished work and was heading home when she slipped on a wet floor that had just been mopped. "Erin!" the cleaner shouted in fear. "Are you okay?" Erin attempted to stand. She managed, but her left leg was in severe pain. "It's all right," she replied. "Just a bruise." Not wanting to worry the elderly cleaning lady, Erin gathered herself, stood up and limped towards the exit. However, once outside, it became clear that it was more than just a bruise. At the hospital, Erin was directed to the emergency room and asked to wait for the on-duty doctor. After a long day's work and the accident, she was exhausted. She leaned back against the cold, pale green wall and closed her eyes. "Who hurt their leg?" a man's voice rang out. Erin abruptly opened her eyes. "It's me." A tall, thin man with dark hair and a shabby haircut was staring at her. "What happened?" "I've fallen unluckily. I just slipped on a wet floor, and now my foot hurts." "I see. Let's look at your leg." He gently but confidently touched Erin's leg, causing minimal pain. "Ouch!" The girl couldn't help but cry out when the doctor's fingers touched a particularly painful spot. "I think you have a slight sprain, but let's take an X-ray to be sure. I'll drive you." "I can walk myself." Erin tried to object. "No, unfortunately you can't." The doctor put her on a gurney and took her to the X-ray room. She had her X-ray taken there, which the on-duty doctor immediately reviewed. He then reassured Erin, "Everything's fine. As I expected, it's not a fracture. Now, let's treat it." He led her to the dressing room. As Erin settled on the hospital couch, she asked anxiously, "How long will I need to stay here? I have my graduation in a week, and I really want to attend, even if I'm in a cast." The doctor smiled. "What are you graduating from?" "Culinary school." "Oh, so you're going to be a chef?" "Yes." "I love good food." Where can I get something cooked by my patient?" Erin smiled as the doctor began to apply an elastic bandage. "Well, I work at a nearby restaurant, Paradise Fantasy. Have you heard of it?" The doctor nodded. "I've been there a few times. It's good. I'll definitely stop by during your shift." "I'll be waiting." "Don't worry about graduation," the doctor said. "You don't need hospitalization for a sprain, but I'll write you a week's sick leave. Rest your leg. You don't need a cast, but please follow my recommendations." "I will, thank you," Erin stammered, realizing she didn't know the doctor's name. "Dr. Glenn Vance," he answered and wrote out his recommendations. Erin left the hospital, regretting she wouldn't see him again. However, Dr. Vance surprised her by showing up at the restaurant a few weeks later. By then, Erin had recovered and was back at work. "Erin, a customer asked for you," the waiter informed her, "and he knows your name and surname." Erin tensed. "Did he say what he wanted?" "No," the waiter replied. The girl sighed and walked into the hall, escorted by the waiter to a table. There she spotted a familiar doctor. "Dr. Vance," she said, astonished. The man stood up and smiled. "Erin, good afternoon. I told you I'd come to see you." The girl returned his smile. "Well then, your dinner is on us. What would you like?" "Your choice, just remember, I'm very hungry after work." "Okay," Erin laughed. "Don't worry, we'll make sure you're well fed. I'll prepare the largest portions." Glenn enjoyed his dinner. After he finished, he called Erin over again. "When do you get off work?" he asked. "In half an hour." "May I walk you home? Or if you're not too tired, we could go for a walk." "Yes, I'd like that." The evening was warm and serene. Glenn escorted her home. Erin was currently renting an apartment with a friend, not far from Paradise Fantasies, about a 20 to 30-minute walk away. "How's your leg?" asked the doctor. "Thank you, it's fine," replied Erin. "You've cured me." The man looked embarrassed. "I didn't do anything special. You just had a minor sprain. Your body healed itself, really." "Don't devalue your services," Erin replied. "You are an excellent traumatologist." Glenn smiled. "Actually, I'm an intern in neurosurgery, but occasionally I work in the emergency room, if I am asked." "That's great. Do you enjoy your job?" "Very much. My supervisor, Professor Whitehead, is incredibly skilled. He specializes in spinal injuries. It's a privilege to watch him operate. He literally puts people back on their feet." Seeing Erin's facial expression change, Glenn grew concerned. "Did I say something upsetting?" Erin shook her head. "No, not at all. You tell very interesting stories. It's just because of my family. My father sustained a spinal injury when I was a teenager. He hasn't been able to walk since." "I'm sorry to hear that." They continued their conversation for a while, and then Glenn said, "If you're willing, if you have the opportunity, could you please show me his medical records? I could show them to the professor." "Yeah, I can have my mum send the papers, or I can pick them up myself when I go home." "But why?" "Of course, I can't promise anything, but the professor sometimes treats even patients who were injured a long time ago. I can't guarantee anything, though." "I understand. I'll go home this weekend and bring the documents." A couple of days later, Alberta handed the documents to her daughter. "Everything is for the best, my daughter. If there is hope, thank God. If the professor says that nothing can be done, well, at least we tried." "So, what's going on between you and this young doctor?" her mother suddenly asked. The girl blushed. "Mum, what are you talking about? We've only met once." "You like him, I can tell." "He's nice, very kind and smart, but I don't want to rush things." Erin visited Glenn at the hospital. He emerged from the operating room, tired, damp and dishevelled. But when he saw her, he immediately smiled. "Good afternoon, Erin." "Hello, Glenn. Here are the documents," she said, holding out a folder. He quickly skimmed the statements. Erin noticed a funny wrinkle on his forehead and couldn't help but smile. "I'll show these to the professor," Glenn stated. Just as I've mentioned before, I can't promise anything. I understand. How can I reach you? May I have your phone number? I'll call you myself. She gave it to him. It was nice to see you, Erin. I wish we had more time to talk, but I have to return to my patients. Erin smiled. It was good to see you too. I'll be waiting for your call. Glenn called a week later, his voice filled with anticipation. The professor is intrigued. He wants to speak with you. Can you come now? He'll be at the hospital for another 2 hours. Yes, I'll be there. The professor was a small, short, lean man in his 50s. Erin was taken aback by his energy at first sight. She knew that Professor Whitehead had just come off shift, but he looked alert, as if he had just gotten up after a long sleep. Nice to meet you, Erin, the man said, shaking her hand and smiling. Glenn's been talking about nothing but you lately. Erin glanced at the young doctor, who blushed slightly and looked away. Let's not waste any time, the professor immediately continued. Let's get down to business. He asked Erin in detail about her father, the circumstances of his injury, where and how he was examined and treated, his current capabilities, and even his mental state. Erin recounted everything she could remember. Dad is a very strong man, Erin concluded. He's mostly frustrated with his own helplessness, but he has never given up. He has always tried not to be a burden to my mother and me. I believe he's ready to seize any opportunity he gets. That's good. That's the attitude we need. Remember, however, I can't guarantee success. Erin nodded. I understand. Yes, it is critical that both you and your parents understand this clearly. Don't mistake this chance for a certainty. It's an opportunity, like a coin toss. It could go either way. If our plans don't materialize, your dad will revert to his previous state. I believe Dad would be perfectly content with that, Erin responded. Her father readily agreed, yet she could see fear and doubt flickering in his eyes. I must try it, Graham declared, squashing his doubts. It can't get any worse. If I refuse, I'll spend my life wondering if things could have been different. Soon he was placed in the hospital. Alberta was allowed to be with her husband, so Erin visited them either before or after her work shift, or on her days off. Each visit she saw Glenn. He updated her on the preparation progress. The professor had ordered several tests and was very pleased with the results. The operation is scheduled for tomorrow, Glenn finally told Erin, but you can only see your father a few days later. He'll be under observation in the ICU initially. I'm incredibly worried, Erin expressed, as if I'm the one who will be operated on. I'm nervous too, Glenn confessed. The professor asked me to assist him. The operation was a success. Erin found out from her mother, who called her in tears. Why are you crying if everything is fine? Erin affectionately asked her. I can't believe it really happened, exhaled Alberta. The professor mentioned a long rehabilitation period and all that, but I'm ready for it, so is Graham. We've been given a chance, and we're going to make the most of it. Just a few weeks later, Erin and Alberta were tearfully hugging each other, watching her father wiggle his toes. Gradually he began to stand, then to walk with the assistance of a walker, leaning on the wall or his wife's hand, and eventually on his own. Before discharge, the professor personally prescribed a plan of further rehabilitation. Graham promised to follow them carefully. Well, that's it, said Glenn sadly, as he and Erin parted ways outside the hospital. It was a pleasure to meet you. Thank you for everything, she replied. I thank God for meeting you. Will I see you again? Come to my restaurant, Erin answered and blushed. What about meeting at an off-duty location? The girl laughed. Okay, that can be arranged too. That's how Erin's relationship with Glenn began. They had a lot in common. Both had moved to the city from small villages, found jobs they loved, and envisioned their futures there. A year had passed. Glenn was completing his internship, and Erin was learning to manage a restaurant. Although Mrs. Sullivan wasn't ready to retire as the head chef, she gradually started delegating responsibilities to Erin. Previously, she handled food purchasing, staff supervision, and distribution of tasks among the junior cooks, while Erin observed. Now, Erin had to learn to make important decisions, manage other employees, and be firm. If needed, she had to assertively communicate any issues and ensure the responsible subordinate addressed them. One day, while dining at a restaurant, to Erin's complete surprise, Glenn proposed to her. "It's only going to get harder from here," he said. "The professor took me in his team, so I need to gain as much practical experience as I can. I'll attend all surgeries, even those patients who aren't mine. Plus, I'll be often on duty at the hospital." Erin nodded. "I understand your worries. You know, I'm also still adjusting to the idea of being the future head chef." "But your current head chef, Mrs. Sullivan, isn't planning to leave anytime soon, is she?" "Not for the next few years, no." "Then we should definitely get married now." Their wedding was modest. Apart from Erin and Glenn's parents, Professor Whitehead, Mrs. Sullivan, some colleagues from work, friends and classmates. Erin's father had fully recovered by then, and he and Alberta spent much of the wedding thanking Professor Whitehead. Observing everyone around her, Erin realised that she was genuinely happy with her small wedding. All her loved ones were present, and most importantly, she was beside her beloved, with whom she shared a deep understanding. Their eldest son, Ron, was born a year after the wedding. Initially, Erin hadn't intended for things to happen so quickly, but then she discovered she was pregnant. Her mother comforted her. "I understand that you're afraid of losing your job," said Alberta, "but trust me, your maternity leave will fly by. At work you're valued and appreciated for your talent. Above all, they'll recognise you as a responsible, decent and kind person, which is truly rare. And I'm sure there won't be any problem with Mrs. Sullivan." And Erin's mother was right. Mrs. Sullivan took the news of Erin's pregnancy in her stride. "I understand it's a common occurrence," the chief smiled. "Don't worry, there's no one better than you. Your position will always be here for you, and besides, I plan to work a little more." As for Glenn, he was simply overjoyed. The next day, he brought his wife 2 bouquets of flowers. "One for me, the other from Professor Whitehead," Glenn explained. "He's also thrilled for us." Erin worked until the 8th month. She might have even agreed to give birth in her own kitchen if her husband hadn't been so insistent. "You're surrounded by high temperatures, strong odours, boiling liquids and other dangers in there. Please don't get me worried during my operations by imagining my pregnant wife is in the midst of all these horrors." As a result, Erin found herself at home for the first time in years, with very little work to do. Living in a city apartment differs from a village. There were no cows to milk or chickens to feed. Their home was equipped with all the necessary modern conveniences. So, Erin spent her time reading books, taking walks in the park for fresh air, and inventing creative meals for her husband. Sometimes, if she were in the mood, she would cook for the entire emergency room. Glenn's colleagues eagerly awaited his arrival with a container or box filled with Erin's delicious meal. The birth went smoothly. Naturally, Erin gave birth in the same hospital where her husband worked, and everyone knew she was Glenn's wife. The head of the department personally oversaw Erin, and she felt embarrassed by all the attention. The usual life of a young mother started for Erin. Glenn tried to help, but he was short on time due to his work demands. He was just starting to perform some operations independently, and he had to fully commit himself there. Erin understood this and did not express her fatigue to Glenn. Thankfully, she had help. Her parents, either together or separately, often visited and stayed for a few days. Glenn's parents also helped, but less frequently. Things got easier when Ron started to attend kindergarten. Erin was anxious about how her son would manage without her, but also realised her own need for a break from staying at home. Returning to work felt terrifying. She worried it might take time to adjust back to work, but her skills hadn't disappeared. By the end of her first day back, Erin felt as confident as if she hadn't left at all. "I was sure that your hand would remember everything," Mrs. Sullivan said cheerfully. "How do you like your first day of work?" Erin smiled. "Interesting, so many people around. No one even once screamed, or asked to pee, or turn on a cartoon." Mrs. Sullivan laughed. "Welcome to the adult world." Balancing work and childcare was certainly challenging. Ron was in a period of adaptation, and he was often ill. This meant Erin had to take time off work. However, Mrs. Sullivan was patient. She had already firmly decided that she would pass the kitchen management only to Erin, and was ready to wait. However, when Ron was 3 years old, Erin found out she was pregnant again. "Well, this time will be a daughter," her husband exclaimed happily, but he was wrong. Their youngest son Frank was born. The second time was both harder and easier. Easier because Erin knew what to expect, and harder because now she had 2 children, and her husband was, as usual, often away for work. Erin was proud of her husband, a young but highly respected neurosurgeon. She believed that in time things would change. In a few years, he might become a famous surgeon, maybe even a department head or a professor. Then he probably would have more time for his family. When Frank turned 1.5, Erin enrolled him in kindergarten and returned to work. Mrs. Sullivan immediately asked her, "I hope you're not planning a 3rd pregnancy?" Erin laughed and replied, "No, we're content. Of course, I'd prefer a daughter, but," she quickly added, seeing her boss's disapproval, "that's not now, for sure. Right now I want to work. I miss it badly." Like her husband, Erin was eager to immerse herself in work, but she couldn't ignore her duties as a mother. Eventually they hired a nanny who would pick up the children from kindergarten and care for them until Erin returned from work. Erin considered herself the happiest woman in the world. She had a loving husband, wonderful children, and a job she was passionate about. However, her happiness was soon marred by unsettling suspicions planted by her co-worker. One day Madeline, the waiter, was behaving unusually, and at the end of the shift she seemed on the brink of tears. Erin remembered that she and Madeline lived nearby, so after their shift ended she offered her a lift, which she accepted. On the drive, Madeline began to sob and share her story without any prompting. "We've been together for 3 years, she exclaimed. "He proposed, and we were supposed to get married in 3 months. Then I found out about his infidelity." Erin tried to remain composed, asking, "What exactly did you find out, Madeline?" "That he's been cheating on me almost from the start," Madeline cried, "with nurses from his department." Taken aback, Erin asked, "So, your boyfriend is a doctor?" Madeline nodded, wiping her tears with a handkerchief. "Yes, he's a general practitioner." "And how did you find out about his cheating? Did he tell you himself about it?" "Of course no. I've had suspicions for a long time." Erin parked the car near Madeline's house. However, the young woman seemed oblivious to her surroundings, lost in her sorrow. "I realized later, when I started remembering everything, that it all began a long time ago. When we started dating, he had just begun his residency and was often on duty. He said he needed the experience. If I'd known what kind of experience he was getting." "But it's really true," Erin tried to object. She wanted to add that her husband was also a doctor, and she knew what it was like not to see him for weeks due to work, but she remained silent. Madeline continued, "I believed him. I was proud, bragging to everyone that my boyfriend was a doctor. Sure, I noticed things occasionally. The smell of women's perfume on his clothes, a scratch on his back or collarbone, a midnight text." Erin asked hoarsely, "Did you ask him about it?" "Of course, but he had an excuse for everything. The perfume, They change in a common locker room. The scratches, a drunken man attacked him at the emergency room. And the texts? It's from work. Madeline, who had calmed down, started crying again. Maybe that's what happened, Erin asked Madeline cautiously. I was so sure in his decency. I believed everything for the first 2 years. Then I was told by some good people. The girl sobbed. Who were these people? Erin asked. Madeline stopped crying and wiped her face with a handkerchief. Her face was red and swollen now, and her once beautiful eyes were now narrowed to 2 small slits. One of them was the woman he was trying to make his next mistress. She had just started working as a nurse in his department. At first, she thought he was nice and kind. He offered her tea during one of their night shifts together. She accepted, and then he began to pester her. She became scared and ran away. She told the head nurse everything. And what did she do? Erin asked. She said everyone knew their young doctor didn't miss a skirt, and if you told him you didn't want to, he wouldn't bother any more. Erin could only gasp in response. And that girl turned out to be principled, Madeline said. She found me on social media, suggested we meet and told me everything. I didn't want to believe her, of course, but I spoke to Paul yesterday evening. He denied it initially, but his face gave him away. Then he confessed. I've been mulling what to do over all shift. By the way, why didn't you take the day off? I didn't want to be alone. I thought work would distract me, but it hasn't. Erin gently took Madeline's hand. You should take a few days off. Just make sure you're not alone. Stay with a friend, your mum or your sister. Madeline nodded. But I still don't know what to do about him. I told him we're breaking up, but I can't stop thinking about our 3 years together, and that if I hadn't discovered this, I could have married him, and perhaps lived happily with him for the rest of my life. But you did find out, and you can hardly pretend it didn't happen. I couldn't, of course. What would you do in my place? Madeline asked Erin, who hadn't expected this question at all. I don't know, she admitted honestly. Madeline sighed. I'm sorry, I'm so embarrassed. I have spoken too openly with you. You've been sitting here with me for half an hour, and you have to go home to your husband and children. Erin hugged her. It's nothing, Madeline. Everything will be all right. Don't worry about a man who's not worth your little finger. They said goodbye. All the way back, Erin thought about Madeline's words. She came home, hugged the boys, and let the nanny go. Glenn was on duty today. Erin was already used to it, and usually fell asleep alone without problems. But today she hadn't slept a wink until almost morning. What if Glenn is also cheating on me? No, it cannot be. But Madeline was sure of it, and she is so pretty, she could be a model. And I am already a mature woman, a mother of 2 children. I certainly can't compete with 20-year-old nurses. Has my husband ever smelled of someone else's perfume? Come home with lipstick on his shirt? And the late-night phone calls and texts? Well, the last one certainly was. Being a doctor, Glenn was always on call, even during weekends and holidays, and Erin was used to it, and late-night calls did not raise her suspicions. Maybe I should talk to my husband about it. What will he tell me? Will he confess? I don't think so. And I will look stupid. He'll start to deny it. It'll only make me more suspicious. The next morning she opened her eyes with difficulty, and the first thing she saw was a huge bouquet of her favourite orchids. Happy anniversary, my love, Glenn said. This gesture reassured Erin that her husband was not cheating on her, and she dismissed her earlier suspicions as unfounded. Erin tried to forget her suspicions and Madeline's story. Besides, Madeline quit her job at the restaurant for a couple of months later because she had decided to move to another city after breaking up with her boyfriend. Meanwhile, the life went on, and soon Mrs. Sullivan announced her impending retirement. Yes, Erin, you will soon take over. I will bid adieu and travel to warmer lands to enjoy wine and charm the Spaniards." Erin responded with a laugh. "I thought you preferred Italians." Mrs. Sullivan retorted, "There's enough charm for everyone. I've done my share of work, that's enough." "I bet you'll miss us," Erin sighed. Mrs. Sullivan shook her head. "No, you're still young, full of energy, eager to command the kitchen. That's good, but I'm done. But if that's your decision, I won't object. I hope I'm ready." "Of course you're ready," Mrs. Sullivan exclaimed. "You've been ready for about 5 years." And so Erin became a chef. She now had full authority. She could experiment and change the whole menu. She began introducing her own dishes, which she had long wanted to try. She was thrilled when the guests enjoyed these new additions, and even more so when they ordered them again. However, with such responsibilities, she couldn't consider having a third child. Erin wanted a daughter, but both she and Glenn were working, and Erin put aside her dreams of a third child. On her husband's next birthday, Erin decided to surprise him. She discussed her plan with the boys, who supported her idea. Glenn was on duty the day before his birthday. Erin, Ron and Frank decided that when he came back from his shift and went to take a shower, they would quickly prepare their surprise. And now, after hearing that terrible conversation, Erin lay in bed, unable to rouse herself. Her husband would likely return from the shower soon. Although numerous improbable scenarios crossed her mind, Erin decided not to deceive herself. She chose to face the truth, irrespective of how dreadful it might be. She was strong and could endure. "Why are you lying there, Mum?" The younger son's voice, filled with childish excitement, broke her reverie. Brushing away her tears quickly, the woman lifted her head from the pillow and managed a smile. "Ron and I are almost done," Frank reported. Resigned to reality, Erin got up. The sons had already brought balloons, hidden yesterday, inserted a candle into the cake, and held presents in their hands. "This is yours," said the eldest, handing her a box. Erin smiled with effort and said, "You guys are so good." "Of course we are," Frank responded in a businesslike manner. The sound of the water stopped. All three of them stared at the bathroom door. When the birthday boy, wrapped in a terry robe, stepped out a minute later, they all started to sing Happy Birthday song in an unsteady chorus. "Happy birthday, Daddy!" the boys shouted in the end. Glenn smiled, glancing first at Ron, then Frank, and finally his wife. He then walked over and blew out the candle. The delighted boys clapped their hands and cheers before eagerly presenting their gifts. The father laughed, accepted the packages, and hugged his sons. Erin approached last. "Happy birthday," she said, handing over her present. "Thank you," Glenn replied. His sincere and honest smile made Erin's heart ache. "That's why I never suspected anything all these years. He's been lying to me with the same expression. Of course I can't reveal my true feelings now, not with the boys expecting a party. Later I'll tell them everything. I'll have to, but now I'm not ready." So Erin pretended that everything was fine all day. Her sons seemed oblivious, but her husband occasionally gave her surprised glances, remaining silent. Only late at night, when the boys were already in bed, did he finally voice his worries. "Erin, what's wrong? You seem strange today," he asked. The woman wrinkled her nose painfully. "Well, you started it yourself." "I know everything," she answered, calmly and coldly. Glenn laughed. "A good attempt at a prank, but no, let's talk seriously." Erin sighed. "I heard your phone conversation this morning." "What did you hear?" her husband inquired. His voice had changed, becoming serious. "You were talking to your mistress. She insisted you come right away, but you said you couldn't because of your wife, yet you promised to meet her later." Glenn sighed and covered his face with his hands. Erin tried hard to hold back her tears. "So it's true," she exhaled. "I see." The husband removed his hands from his face, looking at his wife with a sense of helplessness. "I've been meaning to tell you. Let's go," he said. Erin was taken aback. "Where?" she asked. "To meet someone." Silence filled the car during the entire journey. Erin was probably still trying to process what was happening. He's taking me to meet his mistress. He even dared to admit he's been seeing her for a long time. Thinking like this, Erin felt a surge of tears and rage, but chose to remain silent. Finally, they stopped in front of a 5-story building. Her husband confidently got to the 3rd floor and rang the bell. Erin tensed, bracing herself for the encounter, but a small, grey-haired elderly woman opened the door. "Good evening," Glenn greeted her. "I hope we're not too late." The old woman glanced at Erin. "Not too late," she responded. "Jody hasn't gone to bed yet. Come in." Glenn nodded and resolutely walked into the apartment, with Erin trailing behind him. They made their way to the far room, where a girl of about 13 sat at a desk engrossed in a book. "Daddy!" she exclaimed upon seeing Glenn. Her excitement faded upon sighting Erin, and she even retreated a bit. Glenn turned to his wife and said, "Meet Jody, my daughter." This revelation left Erin so stunned that she barely remembered what happened next. She vaguely recalled sitting in the kitchen, sipping tea with an amiable elderly woman who seemed to be Jody's grandmother, while Jody was having a discussion with her father. After bidding farewell to the old woman and Jody, Erin and Glenn left for home. Once they were in the car, Glenn started to explain. "I should have told you about her a long time ago, but I was afraid." "Why?" Erin asked, noticing her voice was now strangely subdued and lifeless. Glenn replied, "There were several reasons. We had a perfect family and suddenly there is a daughter. I wasn't sure how you or the kids would react. I thought it would be easier to leave things as they were." Erin nodded to indicate her understanding. "She's older than Ron, isn't she?" she finally asked, making up her mind. "Yes," her husband briefly replied. "We never discussed what kind of relationships we had before we met." "I didn't have much to tell." "Well, but I have. Just before we met, I was dating this girl named Dakota. She was just a few years older than me. It wasn't even dating, more like a no-strings-attached relationship. It lasted a few months until she got a job offer in another city and left." "Did you ever speak to her again?" Erin asked. "Never. Honestly, I forgot about her quickly because I met you soon." Glenn stopped the car and looked at his wife. "I've never cheated on you. I swear." "Continue." "I found out about Jody almost a year ago when Mrs. Malloy came to me. She's Jody's grandmother. She told me that when Dakota moved to another city, she realized she was pregnant, but decided to keep the baby and not tell me anything. I don't know why. Perhaps she didn't want to burden me, or was planning to marry someone else. Maybe she didn't want a man she didn't love to play an important role in her life." Erin started to piece things together. "So why did Jody's grandmother come to you? Did something happen to Dakota?" "She died of breast cancer. It was detected late and was a type that's difficult to treat. It's ironic since she was a doctor herself. Before her death, she told her mother everything. Mrs. Malloy initially wanted to raise her granddaughter herself, but then she decided that the girl would be better off with her father. She met me, and she said that she wouldn't insist on my care if I didn't want to." Erin smiled. "But you're not that kind of person. You wouldn't abandon your child." Glenn sighed. "Of course, I couldn't live peacefully knowing my daughter was growing up somewhere else. I met her. She was very emotional about her mother's death. I suggested that she and her grandmother move to our town. They've lived here ever since. I visit when I can and try to be involved in her life, helping her as much as I can." Glenn looked at his wife with growing concern. "Say something. If you want a divorce, I'll understand." Erin laughed. "A divorce? Because my husband is the most decent man in the world? Glenn, I love you even more." Erin squinted her eyes and re-examined the plot. "There's a lot of work to be done. At least half of the trees need to be cut down and replaced. The beds are ruined too. It will be easier to start from scratch. But it's not a problem. With such a team, we'll have everything back in order in no time." She was also fond of the house. It was large, just as she had dreamed. There was enough rooms for everyone. A spacious room for her and Glenn, and at the end of the corridor, rooms for Ron and Frank. On the other side of the corridor were bedrooms for Mrs. Malloy and Jody. Erin smiled, remembering her husband's concerns about whether she would get along with the girl. Erin, on the other hand, was thrilled to have the daughter finally she had long dreamed of. Jody was a sweet, well-behaved girl. Initially, she was wary of Erin, but they were growing closer every day. Mrs. Malloy was also a nice woman, and it was unquestionable that she wouldn't be separated from her only granddaughter. Then Erin suggested to her husband that they should buy a house. They had been contemplating the idea for a while, but never seemed to find the time. But now, with the arrival of Jody and her grandmother in their family, they had to speed up their decision. An ideal house appeared on the classified site, as if by magic. It was spacious and priced within their budget. "Erin, are you coming?" Jody's timid voice echoed from behind. "Grandma's already set the table." Turning around, Erin asked, "Of course, sweetheart. By the way, how do you like it here?" Jody shrugged. "There's lots of room and it's quiet. I love that." "Me too." Erin noticed that Jody seemed to want to ask something. "What is it, Jody?" Jody sighed. "Erin, don't you regret it?" Erin raised her eyebrows in surprise. "Regret what? That we moved here from the apartment?" "No, not that." "That you learned about me? If Dad hadn't told you, none of this would have happened." Erin smiled and hugged Jody. "Believe me, Jody, you are a gift of fate for me. I'm so glad you came into my life." She felt Jody's quiet sobs as she held her close and smiled, feeling warm, salty tears on her own cheek.